conferences, seminars, speeches, reading groups, as well as they have a website in which they publish lots of interesting articles. They write articles, they interview people. You could also find book reviews. It's one of the most frequently visited websites in Turkey, by the way, for those who do not know about this. So I am really proud of them, and I thank them for organizing this lecture. I would like to thank Professor Koechler once again, and he's going to make a speech on the situation of the existing international system and international law. As you well know, we are not living at times which are peaceful and sufficiently just. We have lots of problems in the world. We are facing lots of global problems, from excessive armaments to economic and social inequality, pandemic, the spread of pandemic diseases, including COVID-19, the destruction of nature, discrimination, and the lack of transparency and democracy in the international system, and the lack of the problems associated with the United Nations. So we are facing lots of crucial problems. The more we talk about democracy, peace, prosperity, and justice, the less we seem to achieve that. So we need action. We need to act in order to establish a world in which everyone is free, happy, and contented, and peaceful. So this is a challenge that we are facing. We need figures, we need intellectuals, academics, and other political figures as well to bridge the gap between those who hold the reins of power and those who are subjected to oppression and manipulation and military intervention. So we need figures to ensure that the first world, or the North and the South, they live in peace, and they live in harmony, and that they are treated fairly without economic, political exploitation. The world of Islam and the Western world, they seem to really face difficult cases of confrontation recently. Islamophobia is spreading, and there is further marginalization of the Muslim world in the international system. And the UN Security Council consists of 5 permanent members with veto powers, which seems to be one of the main problems that we are facing in the international system. Those who are holding power and those who are subjected to manipulation, oppression. So we have to establish somewhat a dialogue among civilizations. We have to establish peace, understanding, and cultural tolerance towards each other. So we need figures to bridge the gap between the Muslim world and the West, between the North and the South, between the haves and between the have-nots. And actually, Professor Koechler is precisely this figure. He has been working enormously to bridge this gap, to establish really harmony and peaceful cooperation among different civilizations, not only between Muslims and the West, but also China, India, Africa. He has been advocate of all sorts of peaceful cooperation among different states and different civilizations. Professor Koechler is a professor of philosophy. He worked and he taught at the University of Innsbruck in Austria for many years. He's been retired lately, and he is also the founder and the president of the International Progress Organization, which has, I checked, has 70 representatives, represent departments in different countries. It is very effective at trying to establish, sorting out certain international relations problems, peace, justice, and dialogue among different civilizations. During the 1990s, Professor Koechler got increasingly involved in questions of world order, including the role and philosophical foundations of civilizational dialogue. He has written hundreds of books, articles, reports, and conference presentations on a host of different issues. I mean, he's really a prolific writer. He is versed in so many different disciplines, such as, he's actually started as a philosopher, he studied philosophy. He was a scholar of philosophy. He taught philosophy, but then he, switched into philosophy of law, and also political philosophy became one of his areas of interest. And he has written on phenomenology, existential philosophy, anthropology, human rights, philosophy of law, theory of international law, international criminal law, United Nations reform, theory of democracy, and a host of other issues. Professor Köchler has really made contributions to the literature, to the discipline on phenomenology and philosophical anthropology, in addition to many other issues, including international law, of course, which is my own area. And I know him in particular through his writings in the field of international law. So in the field of international and international relations, many of the students are from this department, from international relations department or political science, possibly. He has written extensively on terrorism and international law, search for a more democratic United Nations, the dialogue of civilizations and future of world order, the reform of the United Nations, in particular the Security Council, Palestinian problem, UN sanctions, human rights and international law, international criminal justice, democracy in international relations, and he has advanced certain theories to democratize international relations. I personally, I describe myself as a progressive international lawyer. So I hope I am. And I am really enormously inspired by his writings. Professor Köchler's writings have been an enormous influence on me. His critique of the existing international order, the way the UN is manipulated, the lack of transparency in the international system and lack of democracy. So I really have been influenced greatly from his writings, and I'm really excited to have him here with us, which is really for me really exhilarating. His writings indicate his knowledge, his deep knowledge, his critical thinking, and I think his wisdom as well. And actually, I know that he's a board member of an association in Iran, which is translated in Turkish as Hikmet. I mean, Hikmet in Persian as well, Hikmet. So he's really an inspiration for many people, including myself. Among the books he has written, I mean, he's written so many books, but I'm just going to mention the ones in English, although, as I said, I mean, he's written on so many issues in different languages, in particular, of course, German. The Principles of Non-Alignment, Democracy and International Rule of Law, Global Justice or Global Revenge, World Order, Vision and Reality, Terrorism and the Quest for a Just World Order, the Security Council as Administrator of Justice, Force or Dialogue, Conflicting Paradigms of World Order. By the way, Hans Köchler's one of his books has been translated. I mean, at least I know one, possibly more than one, but the one I know is translated by two scholars of international in Turkey from the political science faculty in Ankara, Funda Keskin, Professor Funda Keskin and Professor Erdem Denk. They translated his book titled Global Justice or Global Revenge. Küresel adalet mi, küresel intikam mı? His books actually have been translated into so many different languages. I mean, almost all the Western languages have translated his books and articles, but he has also been translated into Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, and Chinese as well, which indicates his, I think, compass. This is, I think, impressive. And also, I really found it very interesting to find out that he's been offered, given an honorary professorship in Turkey, in a Turkish university, Pamukkale University. So Pamukkale University awarded him with another honorary professorship in 2008, if I'm not wrong. Since 2008, he's actually an honorary professor at Pamukkale University in Turkey, in Denizli. This is also, I think, quite exciting, which indicates that I think he's quite well known in Turkey. We could go further introducing him, but I mean, he's himself is going to, show how he's has deep thinking and contemplation. So I would like to now give the floor to Professor Köchler to make his speech entitled "The Current International System, International Law, and the Role of the United States." The floor is yours.
I thank Professor Aral for his kind introduction, and I especially appreciate this opportunity to talk to the colleagues and students in Turkey. through the digital technology, which has made it possible even in this very difficult time of a global health crisis to continue to communicate. I shall organize my presentation according to the title which you asked me to speak about. So I will begin with an analysis of the state of affairs, the system as it exists right now. We'll continue with remarks on what the present state of affairs means for the state of international law, and we'll then talk about an issue that is still not really clear as of today, namely the role of the United States, and you have rightly put a question mark after that phrase. So it is partly, of course, one has just to guess and to speculate on the basis of existing trends. And if time allows, I'll see how I manage with the time. If time allows, I may also share with you some of my views on specific difficult issues of international relations in the present constellation, namely questions of the law of the sea, and for instance, the issues in the Eastern Mediterranean, and also the really difficult issue of relations between the Muslim world and the Western world. But it will, and these would be, so to speak, concrete aspects by which I could just explain what I will now say under these three aspects: current state, international law, and the role of the US. So I will see how we manage with the time. So let's begin with the international system as it is right now. And that means that we should also have a look back into history, because we can only understand the present if we are aware of how it has unfolded. And one of the basic facts what we have to be aware of is that the present world order is a kind of legacy of the developments since the end of the Second World War, since 1945. That is also the year when the Organization of the United Nations was established. That means that the special conditions of global order are still in a framework which is determined by the power balance or the power sharing between those countries that were the most influential after the end of the Second World War. It also means that the situation as it exists now follows from how the power struggle evolved in this framework. And it ultimately became a struggle not among five powers. At that time, the People's Republic of China was not represented on the global stage in the United Nations in the Security Council. The seat of China was taken by the Republic of China, what is called now also Taiwan. But the power struggle evolved essentially between two countries, namely the United States and what was at that time the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. That meant that the multipolar system, which may have existed right upon the end of the Second World War, when Britain was also, or was still, a major global player and an empire, that this multipolar structure was developing into a bipolar system. I mean, a power competition between two major players that at the time we did call, all of us did call, the superpowers. One of the basic features of this situation was that these two competitors did try to outdo each other, mainly in the field of armaments. And in that regard, the biggest threat, and I still do recall that as far as my student years or youth years are concerned, the biggest threat that concerned all of us all around the globe, and particularly also in Europe and in the Atlantic area, was that of a nuclear confrontation between these two global powers. Luckily, this did not occur, but realistically, we must admit, I would say, that the main reason why it did not occur was not some lofty ideological commitment or moral commitment, but it was a kind of balance of terror or a kind of mutual deterrence between both, because each of these two major antagonists knew if he would launch or activate nuclear arms, that this would also mean self-destruction. Of course, that was not a healthy situation for peace or for coexistence, because it was not in any way based on a moral conviction or on moral principles. Within a few decades, until the end of, or by the end of the 1980s, anyway, that bipolarity came to an end, for the simple fact that one of the competitors was not able to preserve the integrity of the system. So the Eastern Bloc disintegrated. The Warsaw Pact organization, that was, so to speak, the counterpart of NATO, of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, disintegrated, and a new constellation unfolded. I mean, also the Soviet Union itself dissolved. That was the major event. And the new situation evolved, in which there was no balance of power anymore, at least for a certain period of time. Because in those years, after 1989, 1990, 1991, for a short period of time, it was effectively the United States of America that had this role of global hegemon. And the leadership of the country at this time did also seize upon this opportunity, so to speak, as any leadership of a global power in such a situation of supremacy might do. I still do remember vividly the speech President Bush Sr. gave in March 1991, after the end of what I call the Second Gulf War, because I begin the counting with the 1990s, the first Gulf War between Iran and Iraq from 1980 to 88. And the second Gulf War was that in 1991, led by a coalition under UN auspices, but in fact under United States control, by a coalition against Iraq for the restoration of the sovereignty of Kuwait. And the third Gulf War is the one I will speak later, namely that of 2003, which was unilateral, so without any form of authorization, unilateral war by the United States against Iraq. In this period, when President Bush, as I said, solemnly declared a new world order, whereas from now on, the international relations would be conducted on the basis of lofty principles of law and justice and democracy. That was the gist of his speech. In this new era, in this period of the 1990s, however, what the United States actually did was to undertake an effort to shape the world, so to speak, in its own image. And this was also the decade, as I recall, in which suddenly the terminology of humanitarian intervention flared up. Later, people were afraid to speak about humanitarian intervention because it sounded too much of war, so they used the term action because of a responsibility to protect R2P, but at that time it was humanitarian interventions. And the war in Iraq, of course, in 91 was also justified by those who undertook the war by reference to the United Nations Security Council. But anyway, what those countries actually did, and these were essentially this coalition led by the United States, together with France, United Kingdom, from the other side also Syria. Interestingly, what they actually did was to not merely to restore the sovereignty of the state of Kuwait, but to take out the Iraqi infrastructure. And it was an effort also of just changing the entire political situation and to changing the wider situation in the region in order to take Iraq out of the original power equation. This period has seen other interventions under the name of humanitarian principles. Also an intervention that did not have the formal endorsement of the United Nations Security Council. I mean the intervention on the territory of former Yugoslavia, the intervention of NATO countries in 1999, which was legally a unilateral war. It was not an action of collective security of the United Nations. All these policies, which did use the language of humanitarian principles, all these initiatives were ultimately aimed at establishing an order that was somehow controlled and maintained by the United States and its allies. The New World Order meant reshaping the world, as I said, in not just the American, but somehow in the Western image. However, as always in history, I would say, this imperial strategy was eventually and ultimately self-defeating. Military interventions and other measures of coercion, such as sanctions, backfired. And American political scientists have coined for this effect the term of blowback effect. And the United States and the West in general have felt that blowback effect rather soon. By the way, one must not forget the way at this time, when there was no real arrival of the United States on the global stage, how at this time the United Nations Security Council was effectively used for purposes that were totally contradictory to the respective resolutions and for purposes that only served the global hegemonial power. If you take as an example, also in terms of the backfiring effect, the comprehensive economic sanctions on Iraq, which were imposed when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, and which lasted until 2003, until the main country that instigated them was satisfied. I mean, until after regime change was achieved. These sanctions did cause the death of over 1 million Iraqi people. It's all very specifically documented by international NGO teams, including the so-called Harvard Study Group. Way back in the 1990s, they did a comprehensive study. And what this meant is that the situation in the country was totally destabilized, and understandably, the people who were suffering, the people who died, the people who got ill, the people who got malnourished, did not forget about this. So the position of those countries that insisted on the continuation of these sanctions has somehow become less recognized, or has become weaker, certainly also in the wider Muslim world. The regions that were meant to be secured, so to speak, for the hegemon were destabilized in a pervasive way. What happened was that all of this led to a kind of political vacuum, which was quickly filled by forces that were antagonistic to the hegemon. And it's what always really strikes me is the blindness of power, that all these terrible consequences, when also for the Americans, the situation got totally out of control, for instance, in Iraq, that all of this was not adequately calculated in this, how should I say, enthusiasm of being the only country in the world that would be able to undertake such measures and to change the political landscape of entire regions. And really the most dramatic example, also the most tragic example of the consequences of all of this are the developments in the Middle East since the beginning of the 1990s. It also has meant, by the way, for the countries of the Middle East at this time, when suddenly there was no more a bipolar constellation, that they had lost all room of, they had their margin of independent action had totally vanished, because they found themselves vis-a-vis just one global dominant power, while before there were two great players, and that gave the countries in the region a certain room for maneuver, which suddenly was not there anymore. And as we can see, and we speak about this a little later, as we can see, this situation, by the way, of divide et impera also, it was exploited for a kind of policy of divide et impera, divide and rule. This situation is now, in my understanding, also the biggest problem in the wider Arab world. It has led to a kind of marginalization, even paralysis, of the Arab region right at the moment. But irrespective of these developments in that particular region of the Middle East, what all these upheavals and uprisings and revolts and the disintegration of states in this and other regions also mean is that after decades of bipolarity, unipolarity is also coming to an end. It is being gradually replaced by a new multipolar balance of power, simply because the hegemon has been proven not to be capable to keep the order in those places where he has, where that country or this alliance has destroyed the old order. They were not able to create a new and stable order. Their solutions were not sustainable. we have witnessed in those years now, in the last decade in particular, or the last 2 decades, the emergence of new regional and global actors. And obviously, this also has meant new instability and risks of conflict. Let me just mention as examples 2 features of the current world order in that regard. First, the emergence of new groupings outside the traditional European and North Atlantic framework at global as well as at regional level. One could refer here to BRICS, B-R-I-C-S. I mean, this cooperation format in alphabetical order between Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. One could also mention the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. One could also mention the African Union, which interestingly did model itself after they switched from OAU, Organization of African Unity, to African Union, which switched their model or tried to shape their model and procedures according to what we have in Europe under the name European Union. One could also refer here to the Eurasian Economic Union. And also there were, in my understanding, interesting beginnings in the region where Turkey is now the major players as far as new regional cooperation initiated by Turkey in the Caucasus and Central Asian region is concerned. Second example, second feature I would mention here is a process of what I call recalibration of power in different regions. And one could refer here to the space of the European Union, to the American space. Both of these are losing influence now in this process of recalibration. They are losing influence vis-à-vis the Asian region in particular. And furthermore, at the juncture between the Middle Eastern and European region, we see now the emergence of new powers such as Turkey and Iran. This is also a fact not foreseen let me say, at the beginning of the 1990s, but it is now clearly established that there are new regional players and that the influence of global powers from distant continents or from far away, such as the United States, is vanishing. Because what we see now, and I cannot go here into details because this topic is more general and the time is limited, but what we have seen also is that, for instance, the situation, very complicated situation in Syria, is partly now being reorganized through a regional framework, through the framework of powers that are powers of the region and not powers from some that are on other continents. And I mean here in particular Turkey, Iran, but also Russia. Third feature of the current world order I would like to mention here refers to the global level. There we witness a kind of renegotiation of the power balance of 1945, which I already mentioned, which was a power balance between United States, France, United Kingdom, Soviet Union, and also China, but in the name of the Republic of China. The P5 concert of great powers, P5 stands for 5 permanent members in the Security Council. The P5 concert of great powers is now, I would say, a thing of the past. It only survives in the Charter of the United Nations through the Institute of Permanent Membership in the Security Council. Reform of this statutory situation is impossible simply because of the veto because there is this Article 108 in the Charter, which makes any change of the Charter, and that means also in the composition of the permanent membership of the Security Council, depending on the consensus among these P5, among these 5 powers. The late Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was National Security Advisor of the United States way back in the 1970s, and architect at that time of the country's Afghanistan policy and the country's support for the Taliban, Brzezinski understood the signs of the time, accepting the inevitable, namely that the United States cannot manage the global crisis all on its own. Brzezinski called for what he described as a new global realignment between America and countries such as China. That means he acknowledged the end of unipolarity as a fact. That was just a few years ago, shortly before he died. In conformity, and now there is an interesting new development, and this makes the situation rather confusing in terms of analysis, also in terms of the entire ideology of world order. In conformity with this by now famous or infamous slogan, America First, the outgoing, most probably outgoing United States administration made, or still, as I can hear from President Trump, or still is making steps to further reduce United States military presence around the globe. The withdrawal from Syria, for instance, is one example. But this now particularly refers in the last months of the administration of President Trump. It refers particularly to Iraq and Afghanistan. The United States, at least in the words of the president in his speeches at the United Nations more than once, renounced in principle the policy of regime change, or this doctrine of liberal interventionism, which has been the doctrine of so many of the presidents of the Democratic Party, including Barack Obama. However, I would say the aggressive, extremely aggressive unilateral assertion of national interests, for instance, by way of economic sanctions, has created new tensions and raised many questions as to what this disengagement from conflict zones, that means this abdication as global policeman, can actually mean. Because it was in regard to doctrine, it was a kind of abdication of global policemen. The president said it repeatedly that all these interventions have brought nothing. They have just created chaos and so on. And it makes absolutely no sense to keep troops stationed in all those places of conflict, and they should be brought home as soon as possible. And as we know now, he committed himself to make this step, particularly before his term ends, to make this step in Iraq and in Afghanistan. The unilateral and rather reckless policy of the outgoing administration in the Middle East, and here, of course, I particularly would refer to Palestine and Iran, may altogether, however, leave a dangerous legacy, because one could say, what is really the use or the importance of stating we do not want or aspire to change any regimes, every country should live according to its own system, when at the same time you exercise utmost pressure, as in the case, for instance, of Iran, or also in the case of Palestine, to impose a certain behavior on foreign states. This is also tantamount to coercion. it is tantamount to military use of force, almost. And I will speak about that a little later, if the time allows. Whatever the case may be, the recalibration of the global power balance is accompanied now by a major systemic crisis of world order, as it was established in the name of free trade and free and open exchange, open borders in the post-World War II era. The key term of this approach, by which one described this, did describe this approach, was globalization, or a liberal world order. This was meant, or globalization was in fact meant to represent such a liberal world order of free and unlimited exchange beyond all national borders, but also beyond all traditional restrictions for economic exchange. The result of this, as we see by now after several decades, is not as beautiful as the advocates of the liberal world order in the name of globality would make us believe. What we see is that in many regions and between regions, between the industrialized and the developing world, inequality has also increased. What we also see is that unrestrained, unregulated economic activity between all limits, geographical as well as moral, has resulted in serious environmental degradation and social tensions. And now, in this year, 2020, we witness, or one could say that the pandemic, the crisis of this pandemic, has laid bare all the weaknesses of globalization, namely problems, as I said before, from the removal of all borders and limits to or restraints on economic activity. And in Europe here, we see the situation the situation is really catastrophic. Also in my country, in Austria, from where I speak, our figures, as far as the pandemic is concerned, infection rate, mortality rate in the last week were the highest in the entire world, much higher than in many countries outside of higher than in Europe, but also much higher than in many countries outside of Europe. So it caught all by surprise, and the main reason was that we were not prepared. Also, the Austrian government was just not prepared to act on behalf of the common good. It felt still under the pressure to act just according to certain demands of economic pressure groups. This catastrophe, and it is indeed a catastrophe now, may also intensify in the medium term the competition for global power in this coming post-American order. And it may also lead, as I already said before, or it may also speed up this emergence of Asia as the most vibrant economic power, and the emergence of China as the country that may overtake the United States of America on the global scale. There is, of course, one big caveat. One has to be cautious in regard to this analysis or to such a forecast. What must not be overlooked are the extreme rivalries, even threat of armed conflict between two of the biggest players, or the two biggest players in Asia, namely India and China. Ultimately, whether Asia will emerge as the global economic powerhouse will also depend on whether India and China are able to contain that, or somehow to negotiate a new coexistence among themselves. And for the time being, at this moment, when we watch the developments also in the border area between the two countries, and most recent in the last few days in Bhutan, this is, one can not make any clear prediction. The destabilization of entire regions and the economic equality I just mentioned have also triggered, and that's what we feel here in Europe, have triggered major waves of migration. And this will be another factor of global tension and instability for the foreseeable future. We also see what this has meant or how delicate this has been in relations between the European Union and Turkey. And Turkey, as far as Europe is concerned, Turkey's policies or cooperation with Turkey is absolutely essential for Europe to manage this crisis of migration on our continent. Getting back to the United Nations organization, about which I spoke at the beginning, because of its structure, the UN will be condemned to be a bystander of global developments. This has also been evident in the management of the corona crisis so far. I cannot give now the details. What we have seen is now in this corona crisis in particular, what we have seen is the re-emergence of the nation states as major players. Their re-emergence in the absence of effective action of intergovernmental organizations. That relates to the UN, it relates to the European Union, but also initially, one must state that, and it needs to be investigated, it relates to specialized agencies of the UN, such as the World Health Organization. The crisis could have gone much differently, or it could have been prevented if there would have been much more effective action on behalf of the UN and its specialized agency, WHO. This takes us straight to the second part of the reflections, namely how effective a system of rules of intergovernmental cooperation can be under the circumstances of today, as I have described them. And that is exactly the problem of international law, or more precisely, of the international rule of law in this emerging new multipolar system. Generally, one may say, as far as international law is concerned, the basic problem of law in any international context is the following. Legal norms must be linked to sanctions in case of non-compliance. Otherwise, if there is no link to sanctions, otherwise those are not legal norms, they are moral norms. And that is another field, but it's not a field of the state order or politics. The enforcement of norms through effective measures, through sanctions, I do not mean now what is described in the UN terminology as economic sanctions, but I mean sanctions as the laws that provide a certain punishment in case of violation of the law, as it exists in every nation state. Such kind of enforcement of the legal norms is only possible when we have a system of unified authority. The sovereign state with the monopoly of violence, as Max Weber called it, Gewaltmonopol, is one such system of unified authority. This is exactly also the characteristic of sovereignty or of the sovereign states, that this form of political organization is in a position to preserve the order and stability through the enforcement of legal norms, and to do this on the basis of a separation of powers. Both, by the way, this general authority, unified authority, and separation of powers are totally lacking in the system of the United Nations organization. So internationally, there is no such authority of unified law enforcement. Neither the United Nations nor any other intergovernmental organization, whether regional or global, fulfill the criteria of statehood in this sense. There are some elements of supranational unified authority, for instance, in the structures of the European Union, but altogether, or viewed comprehensively, also the European Union is essentially an intergovernmental structure without such unified mechanisms of norm enforcement, and also without an adequate division of or separation of powers, because the European Parliament is not a genuine legislator. It can only act in tandem with the executive power, with the European Commission. What exists right now at the global level is a multitude of sovereign states with their own more or less advanced or effective legal systems. However, as the topic today, here in our presentation, is global order, I should also deal here a little more specifically with the United Nations. The Charter of the organization aspires to establish the international rule of law in the most basic domain, namely in that of international security and peace, which is fundamental, or is a fundamental precondition of any form of development and progress of the global community in practically all fields, whether economic, social, and cultural. However, the unified enforcement of the basic norm of the UN in that regard, namely the norm of Article 2.3 about the non-use of force, the unified enforcement of this norm has remained an illusion since the foundation of the organization after the Second World War. Simply, there can be no international rule of law unless all illegal uses and threats of the use of force by one sovereign state against another state, and that means in particular all wars of aggression, are prevented or stopped. All acts of aggression must be acted upon by the World Organization. If you have a system in which you can only act upon wars of aggression of some weak states who have no one to support them among the P5 in the Security Council, but if you can do absolutely nothing if one of the P5 or one of the allies of one P5 country wages aggression, you cannot speak of a system where the rule of law prevails. The Charter gives authority of law enforcement to the Security Council in that regard. The Council is vested with the supreme authority that cannot be challenged by any other organ of the United Nations, including the International Court of Justice. Council has this supreme authority to take or authorize coercive measures, including the use of armed force, against a state that violates the peace or threatens international security. But because of a flaw in the procedural provisions of the Charter, this authority had to remain inconsequential. Namely, those provisions giving the Council the power to act against illegal uses of force, these provisions have been undermined completely by the provisions for the decision-making of the Security Council. I mean Article 27.3, which basically means the following, that 5 countries, I mean the P5, have the right to prevent action of the Council in any situation. They do not need to justify that. And this is also so in cases where they themselves are the aggressor. I mean, a P5 country can also veto a resolution on its own aggression. And that is the reason why whenever a P5 country acts or engages in the use of force internationally, the Security Council is automatically paralyzed. It has always been so. Otherwise, the war in Afghanistan could not have been conducted by the Soviet Union, or it would have been at least condemned, and action would have been launched against it. The United States could not have gone ahead in the way it did with the war in Vietnam and so on. The Security Council is automatically paralyzed in all these situations. But there is also another aspect we must not overlook, and that is the absence of a separation of powers. There is no constitutional court of the United Nations. The International Court of Justice is only more or less an advisory body that can, and Turkey is well aware of that also concerning all these Mediterranean disputes. The court can only act if countries on their own free decision decide that they accept arbitration on particular issues. But first, a country has to make such a declaration that it accepts the court. The court itself, and as far as binding resolutions of the Security Council on economic sanctions for the use of force are concerned, the situation is also particularly serious because under the Charter of the United Nations, decisions of the Security Council are above all other decisions of all other institutions, and that includes the International Court of Justice. That was the, how should I say, very big disappointment long ago, already now, for Libya, when it approached the International Court of Justice concerning sanctions imposed on Libya by the United States and the United Kingdom. And the position of the court was, as far as those measures were based on Chapter 7 resolutions, on binding resolutions, the International Court of Justice is not competent. So there is no separation of powers anyway. In combination, these flaws of the Charter mean that any of the 5 countries, namely the permanent members, A, can act with full impunity in cases of its own violations of the law, and B, can impose on the international community a regime of coercive measures that result from a binding resolution for an indefinite period of time, simply because of the veto. And that's what we have seen in this case of the almost, one could say, genocidal sanctions against Iraq that lasted for more than 10 years. They were imposed by the Council on the basis of a Chapter 7 resolution. And although Iraq had fulfilled all the conditions that were initially set for the lifting of the sanctions, they were not lifted simply because the United States did veto any motion of lifting. So situations can be created where such a situation resulting from a coercive resolution goes on indefinitely, as long as just one country, one P5 country, wishes it to continue. And that is something which completely undermines the legitimacy of the United Nations organization, and which also has undermined the acceptance of the organization in many parts of the world. So it is, I think, clear enough. We have no unified law enforcement under United Nations rules. It simply is the power of the permanent members that determines whether the law is enforced or not. And that is tantamount to what quite often has been called, also in regard to the Middle East situation and Palestine, what is a policy of double standards, or more euphemistically, one might say, good old-fashioned realpolitik, using the German term, which is also a common term now in English international relations theory. In actual fact, it is a state of international anarchy where the law is subordinated to the power of the great players. What makes the situation even more serious is that the system cannot be, as I said, reformed because of the veto and because of Article 108, which I already mentioned. This has further meant that, as I already stated initially, the Charter somehow perpetuates the power balance of 1945, because the permanent members will be the same. They will be the same group of countries forever, irrespective of how the global power balance changes. And the power balance, as I already indicated, has changed dramatically in those 75 years since the organization was founded. The P5 may have been the most powerful actors after the end of the Second World War, but they are not anymore, not all of them are now at the present stage major global players anymore. What we should not overlook is, and I think Turkey is also emphasizing this in a very concise and convincing manner, the Turkish president in particular, the structure of the Security Council in terms of permanent membership excludes entire regions such as Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, South and Southeast Asia. As of today, I would say some emerging powers have considerably more global weight than, for instance, the two of the permanent members of the Security Council, namely the United Kingdom and France. What all of this means under the present circumstances, with disputes and conflicts all around the globe, in geopolitically sensitive regions such as the South China Sea, the Mediterranean, in particular the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, Caucasus. What all of this means is that in all cases, in all those cases, international law, unfortunately, is not an effective tool of establishing peace and stability, because the global authority that could authoritatively take up these disputes and conflicts does not act on the basis of the rule of law, but only on the basis of the national interests of the 5 permanent members. It will always depend on unanimity among those 5 states, whether the United Nations can take any action or not, which honestly means or has meant paralysis of the organization. Absent action by the UN, it will depend on ad hoc coalitions among interested states or among involved regional states, whether measures are taken to pacify a situation. Of course, this is not necessarily the same as restoring law in a specific constellation. But we have seen that also playing out in Syria, where the United Nations, because of those effects which I just mentioned, was not able to play any constructive role, and where it was left to regional powers such as Turkey, Iran, Russia, to try to find a kind of compromise. That all of that means that in the present volatile situation, where a new multipolar balance of power is gradually emerging, the system of interstate relations, whether we are happy with that or not, is still largely one of self-help, where each state seeks to assert and defend its interests, either unilaterally or in ad hoc coalitions with the other states. This is certainly not the multilateralism that was envisaged by the United Nations Charter. Collective security, according to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, for that reason, must remain, if I may use an Arabic word, a fata morgana under such conditions. Realistically, I would say there is not much difference to the great power politics of earlier centuries. And just to sum up this part of the analysis of international law, international law, that means law between nations, is still, as of today, subordinated to the struggle for power among sovereign states that define the law on the basis of their own constitution and above all their national interests. Thus, it is not law in the strict sense, namely in the sense of universal and unified enforcement of norms, as it is the case, or as it should be the case, in the sovereign nation state. If it is not the case in the sovereign nation state, nowadays we would speak of a failed state, of a situation where the state disintegrates and where there is no stable legal order anymore. Also, there is no system of international criminal justice that deserves this name as of now. I just make this point without going into details. I have written about that also in the book that was published in Turkey, which you have mentioned in the introduction. But one had so many hopes and dreams about global justice through an international court that would be able to punish all those persons who committed serious international crimes. But unfortunately, as we have seen now, even at the International Criminal Court, for many reasons, which I cannot describe here now, has not been able to administer such a system which would be in conformity with the rule of law in terms of criminal justice. This brings me to the last part of the presentation, and I hope I will stay within the limits of time, namely the role of the country that for a considerable period of time has seen its own role as that of global enforcer of the norms as it defined them itself. I mean, the United States. It saw itself as guarantor of worldwide stability in the absence of an effective system of collective security. And it also, for a long period of time now, was a state which many other states, also in the Middle East, seem to have accepted as global hegemon. Do we still have the connection? Yeah, I just
yes,
because
we have a connection, no problem.
Yeah, because the image. Yeah, okay. So I will continue. As I say, the United States is undoubtedly a state which many other states, and especially in the Middle East, seem to have accepted as a kind of arbiter or even mentor. And I will come to this a little later when in regards to the so-called peace agreements that were concluded under the auspices of the United States, I mean of the outgoing administration of the United States. In this transitory phase, as I described it, from bipolar via unipolar to a new multipolar constellation, the United States, as the flag bearer for many years of globalization at least certainly until the beginning of the Trump era, that will now soon come to an end. The United States cannot anymore play the role of global stabilizer or enforcer of the peace through the fact of its overwhelming power. It is itself becoming, in my analysis, a factor of global instability. And this partly of its own doing. And let me just mention here very briefly 5 aspects why I think that this is so, that the United States seems to become a factor of global instability. First, the US destabilized geopolitically sensitive or geopolitically crucial regions such as the Middle East, something that now backfires. That I already spoke about that earlier. And this has done serious damage to United States interests in the region, but it also has been detrimental in terms of the political vacuum that resulted from these US policies. Second aspect, the United States suffers from what now long ago Paul Kennedy, a historian at the Harvard University, described as the phenomenon of imperial overstretch. That was the title of his famous book in 1987. Imperial overstretch as a result of, for instance, the many military bases all around the globe and the resulting drain on the country's resources. One could also speak here of a phenomenon of geostrategic fatigue, as I would call it. And that somehow one can also sense when one listens to some of the speeches the incumbent UN president or the outgoing US president has given on a global strategy and also on the NATO alliance. Third aspect, very quickly, the overly aggressive assertion of its national interests, and in particular of the interests of its closest ally in the Middle East. This aggressive assertion has alienated the country from traditional strategic partners and allies. The what is particularly problematic in my analysis is the almost total identification under this outgoing administration of the United States and with Israeli interests. It is almost total. And for that reason, the United States cannot play the role of honest broker in the Middle Eastern and Arab conflicts, and particularly not in the Palestinian conflict, in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. What also is to be noted here, if I may put it mildly, is that the United States encouraged rapprochement between some Arab states and Israel. They even speak of peace treaties, but at the expense of the Palestinians, which may be counterproductive as regards the long-term pacification of the region. The peace plan of the century may not really last long after the Trump administration. This is at least my assessment at this point in time. Most important in all of this, of course, or in all of these, among all of these forms of aggressive assertion of national interests on behalf of the closest ally, most important and faithful may be the United States policy vis-à-vis Iran, in particular the sudden departure from the agreement that was concluded in Vienna, from the nuclear agreement, and the extremely punitive sanctions the United States unilaterally imposed on Iran in departing from the agreement it had itself signed, and departing from the agreement that was enshrined in a binding resolution of the United Nations Security Council. What is also quite noteworthy in that regard is that just a few weeks ago, the United States utterly failed in activating the so-called snapback mechanism at the United Nations Security Council to reinstate United Nations sanctions, because it was the United States position that the country would be able to force the Security Council to reinstate the United Nations sanctions against Iran. Of course, no one went along in the Security Council except one Caribbean country, namely the Dominican Republic. All the other countries, that means 13 out of 15, did not go along with the United States. So this effort of the United States to impose a certain position on the Security Council in violation of its own resolutions has failed and has led to isolation, almost total isolation of the United States in the Council. Fourth aspect I would mention quite briefly. What we see now, and this is somehow really of concern also, is widespread domestic unrest and instability due to racial and social tensions in the United States. It goes without saying that such domestic instability may also substantially weaken any country's international position, or its any country's position as a global player, its ability to act internationally as a credible partner of other countries. Fifth aspect, last one in this regard, last but not least, I would refer here to the highly polemical propagation of the America First doctrine, which has alienated important traditional allies such as Europe and has led to an ever-widening rift with China. And this, in spite of the fact that President Trump also always said, and he again did so just a few days ago, as I could hear and see in a speech, as he always emphasized that he encourages each and every leader of all the other countries also to apply such a policy of my country first. The question is, certainly every leadership must be loyal, according to the oath of office, to the interests of the country, and must be loyal to the people of the country. But at the global scale, any country can only assert its national interests in a cooperative approach. It must do that on the basis of mutuality, not unilaterally. It makes only sense, America First makes only sense on the basis of mutuality. But the way the Trump administration proceeded in the Middle East, for instance, has nothing to do with mutuality. It is a kind of imposition of a rule because of certain specific interests of the US and its ally. There is one other important how should I say, risk one should be aware of, irrespective of which administration is in power in the United States. In this time of geopolitical restructuring. And that is what another professor at Harvard, namely at the Kennedy School of Government, Professor Ellison, has described as the so-called Thucydides trap. That is the risk of a war launched by the dominant power, by the hegemon, against a potential rival power. A country that is perceived by the dominant power to threaten the former's hegemony. That was the situation the Greek historian Thucydides described concerning the Peloponnesian War, the confrontation between Sparta and Athens. And that is what Professor Ellison now is warning us about in regard to the constellation between the United States and China. That this confrontation, when the United States realizes that there may be a major real challenge of its so far dominant position, that this may lead to armed confrontation. And it is not, how should I say, it is not just an abstract threat, it is also somehow in line with security thinking of earlier administrations. If we take, for instance, the national security strategy of the United States proclaimed by President Bush after September 11, namely in the year 2002. According to this doctrine, the United States must never allow a constellation to arise where another power would be able to reach strategic parity with the United States. I mean, that is that means ultimately, if one follows that doctrine, all measures necessary have to be taken to prevent this from happening, so that the hegemon can preserve its position. However, like all great powers before, I would say the US cannot arrest history. And Francis Fukuyama's vision of the end of history under a United States guaranteed liberal world order has, in the meantime, been, I would say, wholly discredited. In spite, or maybe because of the fiery slogan, America First, the United States strategic policy around the globe was recently one of disengagement from security commitments. In fact, as I said already, a renouncement of the previous policy of regime change in the name of humanitarian ideals. This also may be an unintended hint as to the imperial overstretch of the post-World War II attitude or posture of the US as global policeman. Also, that was a position, I would say, namely the posture as global policeman, that had some essential bipartisan support, as the United States say. It was also a position on the democratic side of the political spectrum for quite a long time. Finally, what will the transition of, and I think I will have to must come to an end very soon. What will the transition from a Republican administration of an office holder who aimed to reposition the United States in the sense of realpolitik, the transition from such an administration to a democratic one of an office holder who is, in his words at least, committed to a multilateral and more idealistic approach, mean for global stability? We must not overlook the deep structure of politics, which in the US in particular is to a large extent determined by the vested interests. And it is a fact that in the US, almost no one can reach high political office without the support of lobbies or pressure groups. I mean, that is the role of money, or what President Eisenhower, in his famous farewell speech, referred to as the power of the military-industrial complex. Another word, I would say, for what others would describe as the deep state. The president-elect of the United States has repeatedly signaled a change of international doctrine of the United States, namely a return to multilateralism. That means effective departure from isolationism, and also in particular a re-entry of the United States into the Paris Climate Pact, and possibly also a rejoining of the Iran nuclear agreement. However, in a programmatic speech just a few days ago, I listened to it live, he also said that the United States, and I quote him almost literally, the United States will return to the world and will again sit at the front table. This is an interesting statement now from that man who wants to undo everything President Trump has initiated. Whichever ghostwriter may have chosen that phrase for the president-elect, it is indicative of one defining feature of U.S. self-comprehension or self-understanding, namely that the United States will continue to claim the role of dominant player, or, as an earlier democratic administration described it, as the paradigmatic nation. Copyright Madeleine Albright. That was in the years after the Iraq War. Thus, a return to the world after the supposed isolationism of Trump, a return of the world may come at the price of the US again taking the lead and setting, if not the rules, so certainly general parameters for all other nations, and setting also standards, or aiming to set the standards and conditioning its relation and cooperation with other states on norms the United States defines, on how the United States, for instance, sees democracy, how the United States sees or interprets human rights and general humanitarian principles. In my view, a wiser, and I think I will have to conclude with that, a wiser approach for the ghostwriter of the incumbent president would have been to choose the image, instead of sitting at the front of the table, to choose the image of the round table around which the United States will be seated together with other major players as equals. That would be in the meaning of Article 2.1 of the UN Charter, namely of the sovereign equality of states. And with this, I will conclude the presentation now. I see that I will not manage to present the entire analysis I had aimed to share with you. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Köchler. You made quite a sweeping and penetrating analysis of the international order that emerged after the Second World War. And you have signaled that the unilateral world system dominated by the US hegemony, by the US, has been changing to give way to a multipolar international system. You have also mentioned about the rebirth of the nation states as a major center of power in the international system. There are lots of things to this debate about your speech. It's very fruitful. Thank you. It's inspiring. And I'm sure the floor has taken the message. And now I'm looking forward to the audience for questions to Professor Köchler. Is there any question from the floor? Or shall I ask myself before you start? Okay, I'll probably make the first move to ask you, Professor Köchler, whether China and India actually could play the norm setter that could contribute to international peace and welfare and justice as well. Could they provide the norm setter? Could they really inspire new ideas and principles and norms that could enhance the international order and perhaps give the United Nations more convincing performance that the United Nations could become more effective in terms of solving problems? What would you think about that?
Yeah, this, in my understanding, would require that India is joining the Security Council as a permanent member, because as long as India is denied the adequate position according to its size, number of population, economic power, as long as it is denied that place, I do not see how a constructive cooperation could follow in view of the rivalry between China and India. Of course, the big problem here is it would not only be it would not mainly be Western countries such as the US, UK, or France who might object to a change of the charter that would allow, for instance, that would mean the inclusion of India as a permanent member, but the veto would come, or the opposition would come from China. As far as I see, and I have been talking to people repeatedly in both countries, the situation, the animosity is very deep. And as long as the two countries cannot overcome this bilateral tension, it will be very difficult for them to play a major role in a constructive sense beyond the region. And the situation is really fluid, and territorial issues are not resolved. That relates also to part of the Kashmir region. It relates to the area around Bhutan and so on. So the border dispute now is in a very hot phase. There was armed confrontation and so on. So that is the real problem. And there is no one who could really mediate. If there is a kind of rapprochement, it must come directly as a result of negotiations between the two countries. And yes.
Yeah. Professor Köchler, I actually particularly I am interested in terms of the way in which they can formulate new ideas. I mean, I'm not sure talking about they may be hostile towards each other, but they may become a center of non-production and production of new ideas.
Oh yeah.
Do you think they can do this? Do they have the potential to do that, in your opinion?
Yeah, this is my experience, by the way, from many conferences, lectures, and also cooperation with scholars, international law scholars, and political scientists in both India and China. And in both countries, I have taken part in debates on international law. For instance, this book about global justice or global revenge has also been republished. The second edition has been published in India for the Indian market, and there is a very comprehensive discussion going on in India now, for instance, on international criminal law and on ways to make the International Criminal Court a credible institution of criminal justice, because India, as China, is not a state party of the court. And India, in spite of the many efforts undertaken by court officials themselves and by Western countries in particular, India is not convinced that it should join under present statutory conditions. Yes, there are And also in China, I do recall many substantive debates, particularly also on the norm of the use of force, on humanitarian intervention, and so on, where Chinese scholars contribute to international law discourse. And I'm also participating in the Chinese Journal of International Law repeatedly.
Thank you. One of the audience has asked the question: the natural disasters, great disasters that we face, like pandemic, the existing pandemic, what sort of influence would it have on the international system? That's the question that one of the audience is asking. What would you say to that?
Yeah, the people, I think, are disillusioned now with the ineffectivity of international organizations at the worldwide level, namely the United Nations, but also at the regional level. And here I have the facts of the European Union. The problem was that each state, for instance, if I take the experience in Europe, each state did just act rather hectically to defend or to improve its own position in that catastrophic situation. For instance, the transport of emergency equipment, masks, and so on, was blocked by one country, or even equipment was confiscated, although that was ordered through a legal contract by another country. So we have seen that the international structures were totally inefficient. The European Union was not able to organize this in a systematic and fair manner. Let's hope that they have learned. In the meantime, they had now almost 1 year to learn, and that they will do better as far as the distribution of the vaccination is concerned. As far as the World Health Organization is concerned, it should have been in the forefront. But there the problem was that it acted politically. It wanted to accommodate China. I mean, the Director General mainly wanted to accommodate China. And I followed this almost on a daily basis in January and February. They delayed the classification of this situation as a global health emergency for several weeks. And they did not classify it as a pandemic until very late. And also the mistake they made as a United Nations specialized agency was just to use the information without any investigation on their own, the information they got initially from the country where the pandemic originated. An international specialized organization should be managed on a purely professional, not on a political basis, and should also be able to investigate the plausibility of facts that are submitted to it from the member states. But it seems there is not the adequate organizational structure is not yet there. But that is not only a problem for the WHO. In the WHO case, it is particularly severe because this is about life and death, but it is also a problem of other specialized agencies, such as...
Thank you. We have 3 more questions. I would like to pose these questions one by one. The first question is about international terrorism. One of the viewers is asking, while there is so much, arms trade in the world, and many states are gaining money through arms trade, how is it possible to really eliminate terrorism or at least minimize it? That's the first question. Or let me ask the other question after you give the response. Okay.
Yeah, there is, of course, a huge double standards in terms of the arms and in terms of use of force. Almost practically every country condemns illegal uses of force and particularly condemns terrorism. But major industrialized countries, including, for instance, also the German Federal Republic, are at the same time major exporters of arms and also exporters into conflict regions. For instance, as far as Germany is concerned, now a big debate or big issue is that of exporting arms to the region of the Arabian Peninsula, where there is a major conflict, also with terrorist implications in Yemen, for instance. But generally speaking, we have this problem also of inconsistent definition. One country's terrorist is another country's freedom fighter. The United Nations, and that's an unresolved issue still, the United Nations has still not been able to legally define what terrorism means. There is no legal definition of the United Nations. And so quite often you will find the excuses. A country will say, yeah, we export arms on the basis of our criteria, and because a certain movement or a certain group is classified as a liberation movement, and the system, the country against which they operate, is seen as a repressive system. For that reason, they would justify the export of arms. But it is a terrible, certainly it is a terrible double standard. But under the present system, it would be very difficult to resolve that. It will be very difficult to introduce honesty, or, for instance, to force countries to give up their arms export policies. Quite often, the only measure to do something about it is the mobilization of civil society in particular countries. That's what we have seen also in European countries. Mobilization of the people against a country exporting arms into a war zone.
Mm-hmm. Professor Köchler, there's another question about the balance of power. The new balance of power, which is emerging,
Yes.
and you describe it as multipolar, and possibly lots of
Yes.
non-Western states are emerging
Yes.
as new centers of power. Do you envision another international order in which the balance of power idea does not reign? I mean, do you envision an alternative conception of international order where peace is not based on simply balance of terror? Do you anticipate that, or do you think it's going to be a repeat of the same idea of the balance of power?
That would be a dream, to have an international system where power does not count, so to speak. But in reality, what we can expect is a system where at least we have a situation in which no country is in a position to impose its will upon the rest of the world. So at least a situation in which we do not have an hegemonic position. And a balance of power, of course, also may exist if there are only two major players, as we have seen during the Cold War. But the ideal situation, again, would be a constellation where more than two countries are important players, and where all the regions of the globe are somehow represented. That's why I have made this proposal for in the discussions about this reform of the United Nations Security Council, that one should abandon the present system of identifying particular individual country as permanent members, and one should reorganize the system in such a way that regions are represented as permanent members. So that means the region of Africa, the region of Europe, and so on. And the main thing for a balance of power is the kind of the aspect also of justice and fairness. Of course, it's a bipolar balance of power, in my view, is better than a unipolar constellation, because when you have two competitors, the other smaller countries in whichever part of the world they are have more room to maneuver, have more freedom to act, because between the two major players. But the ideal or a better situation would be if every region of the world would be properly would be somehow have a say in such a multipolar structure. But without power, I mean, without power as the determining factor of world order, I think this would be an ideal situation where the human beings would depart from an assertion of their national interests. So far, we have not reached that stage of commitment to the global common good as would be ideal. We see that also now in all these debates on the law of the sea, where every country makes its claims and where the claims are usually at the expense of the others.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
So we have one of the questions is about imposing sanctions. One of the viewers asking the question: is it possible at this stage to impose sanctions by the United Nations Security Council against a state because of the presence of the coronavirus pandemic? Because of the pandemic, is it illegal for it? Is it not permissible to impose sanctions against a state due to the existence of the virus? That's the question.
Yeah, here we must distinguish between sanctions imposed by the United Nations Security Council, which are multilateral sanctions, and unilateral sanctions. The United States now engages in a policy of unilateral sanctions almost all around the globe, and it continues to do so. The problem is that of what the Americans also would call, or what the United Nations also called, in the case of Iraq, humanitarian exceptions. And they also use quite often, also in the Iraq debate, what was used was the term targeted sanctions. Sanctions would need to be modeled in such a way that they do not hit the civilian population. Or, for instance, in the case of Iran, I was not able to verify it, but what I hear from the United States business community, also from companies in the medical sector, is that there are exceptions of these sanctions against Iran. There are exceptions for medical goods, medical services. But generally speaking, in light of the terrible experience with the Iraq sanctions imposed in the name of the United Nations, such targeted sanctions often are only cosmetic measures, because if sanctions totally weaken the economy of a country, and that is, for instance, also the intention of American sanctions against Iran. President Trump always speaks of the most severe sanctions in the history, and so on. If sanctions are meant to totally weaken and subvert the economy in a situation of an epidemic or pandemic, this generally means also a weakening of the state infrastructure in all the services, including the medical services, even in a situation when you would say, yeah, but our medical companies, they may still undertake exports to Iran and so on. But legally, of course, the problem is nothing can be done about internationally. One may say, what our organization did, we were the first in 1991 to raise the issue at the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva, the issue of the sanctions, comprehensive economic sanctions, as a violation of human rights. So one may get a condemnation by the United Nations Human Rights Council, but it will be without effect, it will be without consequence, because if, for instance, the United States or any other P5 member is the council that imposes unilateral sanctions, the council is impotent. The council cannot do anything because of the veto, in spite of the illegality. And that now is, there seems to be a consensus, at least since we have taken it up, and I have written also, I think it was the first analysis of this, which we published in Malaysia at the early 1990s also. there is consensus that a sanctions policy that affects the humanitarian situation, health situation, and this is particularly so in the case of a pandemic, is a violation of basic human rights, and in that regard also a violation of international law. But there is no consequence out of.
Thank you for the extensive answer you have given us. We have got two more questions, if you don't mind.
Sure, please.
And we can wrap it up the lecture, if you like. One of the questions is there any possibility of establishing alternative international organizations that could combat against injustice more aggressively, more effectively? Is it possible regionally or internationally? Do you envision such a possibility?
I have spoken about that repeatedly since maybe since the end of the Cold War. In fact, the problem is, if we look into history, the League of Nations as the global organization, first global organization, came into being after the end of the First World War, as a result of the peace treaties after World War I. The League of Nations failed and was phased out. It failed because there was another World War, and again, as a result, or at the end of the Second World War, the United Nations organization came into existence. By the way, legally, the League of Nations still did exist until 1947, but it was more or less dormant since the Second World War. But the lesson is, it is very difficult to come up with a new global system that is really representative of the international community, unless there is a kind of vacuum at the global level. That was the situation after the First World War, and was the situation after the Second World War. How to create something new on the basis of new premises in a situation where there is a continuity of the power constellation, that's what we have now. This is very difficult. It's very difficult to achieve. In the meantime, what is possible is that some countries that feel that the global system, as represented by the UN or other specialized agency, is really not effective, that they will join forces and will coordinate policies among themselves and will set up structures of cooperation. And that is what the countries of BRICS did, and what some other regional groupings are doing. I think that will be the way forward for the time being, and I just do hope that it will not need another world war to have some new and promising structure of international cooperation. I just hope that that mankind has learned the lessons of these two catastrophes in the last century, and will be more wise in the future.
This question actually made me think about the Islamic Cooperation Organization. I mean, if, for instance, Islamic Cooperation Organization had decided to strengthen itself to become more effective, if the states have agreed to transfer part of their sovereignty, and they decided that it should be a supranational organization. Do you think such an eventuality would really contribute to international law and justice, and perhaps a greater say of the non-Western world in the international system?
It could be. I followed with interest also the statutory change, because the organization was known as the Islamic Conference, Organization of the Islamic Conference. Now it is the Islamic Conference, Islamic Cooperation Organization. Yeah, so that says something. And I do recall, by the way, that I have been cooperating with the organizations in the old days when it still had the name of the Islamic Conference Organization with Secretary General Habib Shati about a Muslim-Christian dialogue, but that was way back in the 1980s. Now my hope is that under new conditions and with a new organizational structure in terms of a cooperation among the member states in many different specific fields, that the organization will be able to play a major and constructive role globally. The problem I see now are for the time being, are the deep rifts that exist at the moment among some of the major players in the Islamic world. I mean, Saudi Arabia and Iran. This, it would be important that somehow this fraternal conflict among Muslim states can be sorted out, because it is a very, very difficult situation right now. And the United States should not, in my view, should not play any role in that. I mean, referring to the initiatives of the outgoing president.
Okay, thank you. And final question from one of the viewers. The question is, the student is asking as to how he could improve his knowledge of international. He wants to develop his knowledge of international law. What
Sorry, I did not get. Could you say that?
One of the viewers is asking, who's apparently interested in international law. He wants to take your advice about how to improve himself, about getting greater knowledge of understanding of international. How can he improve himself in the field of international? What would you suggest him do?
In the field of international law?
Yeah, that's one of the questions. What would you suggest in terms of maybe sources, in terms of methodology, in terms of activities? Anything you want to say about that?
What I would say is what is essential is, and nowadays that is quite easy compared to earlier times, to read international legal analysis on major conflicts. One can learn a lot from that, how international law is applied in the analysis and in proposals to solve those conflicts, whether this is the Middle Eastern conflict or also this is closer to Turkey. For instance, the Eastern Mediterranean conflict. This is a very important area of international laws, where international law is still developing. I mean, the law of the sea and all these definitions, legal definitions now of continental shelf, exclusive economic zone, and one. All of this is, I mean, this is one example where one can study the mechanisms of international law. And what I would also recommend is to pay attention to the law of the United Nations as it evolved since the 1940s, for instance, to study the documents of the drafting commission in Dumbarton Oaks, the documents which include all the texts of the debates of diplomats and legal scholars, how to draft a charter for the international community that would regulate peaceful cooperation. That, and also the records of the San Francisco conference, I would recommend to study.
Thank you, Professor Köchler. Hans Köchler has provided us with extensive knowledge and experience concerning international law, international order, and international politics. We have greatly benefited from this lecture. And you also made us think about many of the critical issues of the current international system. we have to think alternative ways of improving existing world order so that peace and justice prevails. I think there is no further question. You have answered extensively, satisfactorily all the questions raised. I thank you for your participation. We are honored for your presence, Professor Köchler. I also thank the viewers for participating this in a fascinating occasion. And I would like to ask Kaya Şeker, as organizer of İlim ve Medeniyet Topluluğu, to wrap up our lecture. Kaya, the floor is yours, Kaya.
Thank you a lot for this conversation, and we all of our participations, and I am. Thank you for all this.
I also would like to thank once again İlim ve Medeniyet Topluluğu of the Medeniyet University, who have been extremely inspirational and active in the way in which they have organized, conferences, seminars, and they have continued publishing their views through websites, and they are really proving that the youth in Turkey can really establish great achievements in many areas, academic and intellectual areas, that they have a lot to be proud of them. And you have also proven today with this wonderful organization that you have the potential really to make this world a better one. We trust you and we are happy with you. And again, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Köchler. Would you like to say anything else at the end, Professor Köchler?
I did enjoy our conversation, and I am looking forward to continue our exchange on international affairs and international law. And maybe in the not too distant future, we can also meet in person. I've been so often to Istanbul, and I'm really looking forward to return to Turkey as soon as this pandemic is over.
As Muslims say, inshallah. Inshallah, we say. We would be happy to see you, inshallah, in the future. Thank you.
Thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye. Goodbye.